So welcome to this month's Lunch and Learn. We're really excited to be celebrating Indigenous Month, and we have a really special guest speaker. This is Bill from Ho-Chunk Nation, and he is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. So welcome, Bill.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to apologize, first of all, because I have a bit of a frog in my throat today. I noticed on the way down here as I was driving from where I'm located up in Blackbird Falls, Wisconsin. I was on several phone calls there, and I wasn't able to get rid of this frog, so I apologize for that. I've been speaking for most of this month, though, to different groups, various areas throughout the Wisconsin and Illinois and Minnesota area. So I have been trying to get through this month. As everybody here may know, it is Indigenous Heritage Month, recognition of Indigenous tribes, I guess, in short. So we get a lot of calls, a lot of folks reaching out to us to see if we could come and speak a little bit about our Indigenous knowledge, about our culture, our heritage, and our ways of life. That said, she mentioned my name was Bill Quackenbush. Not that matters too much. That's what I put on my papers for the end of the year when I pay taxes. That's my tax-paying name, they say. What I enjoy doing, though, is I do like to introduce myself in my traditional language. You know, so to say that, I say Ho-Chunk Rajada Nawachuk Gije Hingayade Humpte Hancha Haipi. And all I said was, my name's Knocks Down Fence in the Ho-Chunk language. If you know anything about Indigenous culture, our language is a very descriptive type language. Everything we say tends to have a description within its wording. When I said Nawachukije, which is my Ho-Chunk name, that means knocks down fence. If you translate it to Wisconsin or to English. And it really isn't what it translates to in English. What really is important is the stories that comes with the name, as we are gifted our names by our elders. When we are first born, we tend to have a language that will describe us as in relation to where we are born. Like our firstborn boys, for example, are called Kunu, right? Our second born son is Hena. But as you become aware of yourself and understand our Ho-Chunk language and kind of start understanding, you know, the surroundings around you, that is the time we begin to get our Ho-Chunk names. There is no reason to gain a name if you really don't know what it means or what the understanding is behind that name. I received my name back by my elders, my uncles, for lack of a better term. And with that comes beautiful stories that, like I mentioned, is within the stories is what your name fully means. That knocks down fence, they realize means many different things. It's an old name. It goes way back for many generations of time in Ho-Chunk history in Wisconsin. And what it's speaking about is these animals that no longer walk the face of this earth. You know, that seems like a long time ago. You know, but in reality, we tend to lose a lot of things within our lifetime, they say, right? And you see a lot of animals within our lifetime, for example, that has no longer exist on this earth. They've grown extinct, right? Or whatever reason it is. And it's no different than my name. That knocks down fence refers to a story. One of the stories, in fact, is where at one time, living indigenous to this region here, there were these large-faced bear, they refer to them as. Those bear no longer exist. They grew extinct some time after the glacier episode had taken place here, where that glacier went back to the north, and the earth or the climate had warmed up to such a degree here. A lot of those large animals that we're accustomed to in our culture and in our region here, they went the other way. You know, you always hear about science out there, right, about these anthropologists or archaeologists or whatever ologists they want to call themselves. They talk about these animals that roamed this earth here for many thousands of years, only to go away when that glacier left, and the likes of the mastodon, right, and they talk about the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger. None of these animals really exist anymore because the environment just wasn't conducive for them to stay here. And I received period of time, though, when our Ho-Chunk people, our relatives living along that glacier's edge, you know, were living here comfortably on here, and that name came to be for the Ho-Chunk people. And what it's referring to in that name is that when these bear would come into our villages of old, they were large animals, and they would come and try to maraud our villages there and take our youth away from us there, and people that were they could capture from us there. And our men would go out there in the forest and repel them back. And at those periods of time, we used to have to put these briar type fences around our villages here, kind of like a barrier to keep these bear at bay from coming into our villages on their own free will. The issue with that is that the bear would jump over the fence and they would come in there and maraud our villages, and as they would leave there, as the men would repel them back there, the bear would jump over the fence, and they were ever so subtly drag their front paw across the top of that briar and knock it down some. And so the name I received refers to that process, this bear. These bears that would come into our camps or villages there, and they would knock down that fence ever so subtly, so it would make their opportunity to come back into our village that much easier. And so that's where my name comes from. It's now what Chuck DJ, it rolls right off of your tongue. That's what my name comes to. And through the years, as I received this name, they realized that is another form of name out there that I do for a living. I come into groups and communities like this as educational outreach, right? And I try to knock down some of those barriers. I try to knock down those fences that you see between different cultural groups out there. So that said, when I present up here, just keep in mind that why tribes actually come out into the public and speak during this 1 month a year to many groups out there is because we want to take this opportunity to knock down some of those barriers, for example, out there, and share some of our knowledge and some of our culture and some of our heritage that has taken us through many thousands of years living indigenously in this very same footprint that you're sitting here today. So when I talk about the Ho-Chunk people, I do a lot of presenting to different groups. From kindergartners all the way up through the educational process up to advanced education, and now I sit here before you folks today here at an elder center here talking about our heritage and culture, and I think everybody benefits from this. I usually, when I present, I tend to take home more than I actually speak about. I learn so much more from the interaction I get from the communities and the groups of people I speak with. And years ago, I spoke with a group down in along the Wisconsin River down there, just south of Richmond Center down there, is a little town of Muscadet area down there. And there was a group down there that they are having their annual heritage preservation meeting of their community down there. And they were hosting it at none other than an elderly center down there. And they asked me to come and present to that group down there, and it was their annual meeting, so they had all of their historians and all those folks that just love to study about the history and just talked about their community to a high degree of the knowledge out there. And when they asked me to speak to them, I didn't really understand exactly what they were looking for, but they asked me, could you explain to us, in an hour at our board meeting, our annual meeting there, how did the Ho-Chunk people, or how did the Indians, right, this is how they termed it, how did the Indians survive the many cold winters that Wisconsin has out there all these years and still be here today? And I thought that was kind of odd, there was this simple need for this knowledge of how indigenous tribes, especially the Ho-Chunk, has survived. That's how they termed it, the many hundreds of years living in Wisconsin with the terrible winters that we had. Now, I love our four seasons. They often refer to this area as God's country, right? That we got everything you need and more in this area here. We got four beautiful equal seasons out here that if you don't like one, you just got to wait 3 months, you got another beautiful season, right? And that's the way my mentality has always been since growing up, is that I didn't look at winters as being harsh or severe. It's just living in today's society out here, we have ways of getting around that cold, right? We live in beautiful homes out there. We drive vehicles that are heated up there. So that question was somewhat of a stumper for me. yeah, these elders that were sitting in there, they came from a time when they were growing up there and they didn't have air conditioning in their vehicles, right? And they had to heat with wood at times, and this type of life was a little more different than it is even today. So I put a small PowerPoint presentation together to deal with winter life for the Ho-Chunk people. And I presented to that group there, and I spoke for about an hour. But I stayed there for close to another hour there, fielding questions and talking about the local community there and how they survived, and not only survived, but really enjoyed the Wisconsin winters of old. And that really, to me, was an eye-opener to that group there. That, and as I stated, I tend to learn more talking to a group than I actually offer. So, but speaking on this presentation up here, you'll see the title up here, The Relevance of Oral History in the 21st Century. And not a lot of folks realize that, there's not too much accurate history written about indigenous people out there. You'll have a lot of books written about aspects of our culture or certain components of that, how we, hunted and fished or how we lived and this and that, and it's sporadic at best. And the issue we have with that, as coming from the viewpoint of me as a preservation officer, is we didn't write it. It's usually a third party or people studying us that tend to write this information that's usually off base or not based off one situation, but mostly hearsay and theory. So when we present on this, oftentimes I said, well, we emphatically believe in an oral history or oral process to pass on our heritage and our culture and history to the next generations of people. Well, the next question they ask is, well, that can't be very accurate. I mean, within several generations, you could lose your culture and history from that process, or so they feel. And I mentioned to them, I beg to differ, because what we do with our oral history is far more exacting and more factual and accurate than the written history or history of the other people has written about us thus far. So when I talk about the Ho-Chunk people, you'll oftentimes see this emblem out here, and it's a insignia that we had to place on various items such as our flag and our letterheads and so on and so forth as we created a form of tribal government to succeed, get by in this day in life. But when you mention, the Great Seal of the Ho-Chunk Nation, in there that's mostly written in English. But there's one word in there that in fact is Ho-Chunk, and it's Ho-Chunk itself, right? And if you've ever said Ho-Chunk at all you're doing in my language is saying the people of the sacred language or the people of the big voice. That's how it's rendered in English. So people of the big voice is what oftentimes people refer to it as out there. But in short, you're speaking Ho-Chunk, right? You'll find that with our English language that it's a combination of many different languages out there in reality, right? You have a lot of French influence within the language, a lot of German influence in this region, in the languages. Pittsburgh itself, right? That's the German name, right? And then so you really truly can't call it, an English language out here. It's a combination of a lot of languages, and that's no different than we incorporate Ho-Chunk in a lot of you see a lot of that language of ours incorporated in our ancestral footprint. Oftentimes you'll hear the term Dejop, right? And you'll see that on our bingo hall over there. We helped them create a residential hall of the university system here some 7, 8, 10 years ago. That's called Dejop Hall. And Dejop, that term Dejop in short means 4 lakes in Ho-Chunk, four lakes, which describes, like I mentioned, our language is very descriptive. Every time we say a word in Ho-Chunk, there's a meaning behind it that describes you. It kind of puts you in a place. When that name Dejop came to be, it was when our ancestors were living in this area here, soon after that glacier went to the north, for example, and these 4 lakes came to be. And that's how it received its name, 4 lakes. It took a period of time for those lakes to develop and materialize from a larger glacier lake that sat here. But as those lakes developed there, we have these beautiful oral stories that talks about the series of the processes of these lakes that began to appear on this glacier episode. So when we talk about oral history, though, that's what I want to focus on, is that our oral stories here, they relay accurate information through oral traditional practices that is passed on through time immemorial for us. We have origin stories that talks about a creator, for example, that places us in an area called Mogulshuch, Red Banks. And that Red Banks physically no longer exists there because the last glacier episodes have kind of scarified the ground and removed a lot of the areas there that was recognized as red banks. But if you look at this map over here, which is a small map, I'll show you where Red Banks is on here. Let me see if I can find a bigger map. Right here. So on this map here, Mogoshuch right here, up there is in fact, in Ho-Chunk means red banks. A very descriptive name. I mean, it's very hard to visual anything else. And the moment we close our eyes, you know, in Ho-Chunk, when you hear a word such as red banks, it puts you in that spot. It's like when you guys close your eyes and say Mississippi, right? You know exactly where that is. Now, in English, Mississippi means nothing to you, right? It means nothing. It's actually it's a Sioux name, but it puts you there. And no different than any of our indigenous descriptions of our footprint, our ancestral footprint, which went from Mogoshuch all the way out to Nichade to Manichcho, where we gathered the potatoes. And so the first time those potatoes came to be in our region, it was in that area there. They're a wetland type plant. It's an Indian potato. And that's where they first came to be soon after that glacier went to the north. All the way down Nichade, right there, or the Mississippi, you know, all the way down to where the Illinois River confluences into the Mississippi, all the way back up to Gushkechanuk over here, or Skunk Trail, or Skunk Village. That's what that's called. There's a reason for that story. All the way back up north, up to Mogoshuch. They say at one time you could travel anywhere in this footprint right here and run into none other than Ho-Chunk people. And that's a big footprint. We have beautiful stories that talks about our presence in this area as we had to adapt as humans in this area, you know, through time, or we would have ceased to exist, right along those other animals, you know, that are no longer here. Those ones I mentioned, right? Those mammoth and the short-faced bear, the giant sloth, and all these animals that couldn't take the warmer climate on here, and they ceased to exist. As humans, we had to adapt. We have one God-given gift, right? This up here that puts us apart from all of our animals and all the other aspects of what Mother Earth gives us right out there, right? The plants, and the water, and the air, and the soils, and everything that she gives us, including these, you know, our life out there. We have one thing that they don't have, the ability to think at a higher attitude for humans, right, and mankind. And as we talk about our Creator placing us in Mogoshuch there, we say this is where He placed us, this is where we were created, this is where our first fires were lit. That is where we first came to be, and from Mogoshuch, ancestrally, we spread across our ancestral footprint, and this is where we've always been. We don't have migration stories, we don't talk about coming across a Bering Strait over there, we don't talk about us, you know, evolution-wise coming from monkeys. We don't have stories like that. We have a beautiful belief system that places us in a place called Mogoshuch. And a lot of people don't, I guess, view indigenous tribes as having these creation stories, and our oral history is just full of them, you know, of how we came to be, and we, as we grew as a population in this area here, all the beautiful experiences as we would unfold in our ancestral footprint. Now, a lot of people ask, well, how many hundreds or thousands of years was that, you know, in our time? And oftentimes when we talk about our history, we don't use numbers like, in Western society. You know, that's the number system is, you know, your guys' folks' thing. You know, ours, we use stories that put us in a place and time. And oftentimes when we talk about, you know, as a preservation officer, the stories that we talk about as we grew into this region over here, and as we'd go over to the next rise, we discovered something new. Those stories were so beautiful, and through time, they say, well, you don't have a written language, how do you keep that information, right? And I beg to, you know, differ in that throughout our ancestral footprint through here, you'll find oftentimes a lot of rock art, right? A lot of petroglyphs and petroglyphs. And you'll even see, like in Madison, as a great example of another form of speaking or writing your history or putting your history down. And it's through those earthworks that you still find in the Madison area here. And those earthworks are nothing more than burial systems, right? You know, you go up there to, what is that, Mendota Mental Institute up there, you walk up the grounds and you'll see these giant bird effigies. Or you'll see there's a panther, a water panther over there, or you'll see, you know, some other form of earthworks. And those were placed here some 2,000 years ago, give or take a few years, right? But that period of time was a transition in our society of a people here, that we took on something that was brought to us from the South, to add to our culture and our heritage, and developed it unique to this region, only for it to not really work for us as a society of people. So we quit making those earthworks and went back to a traditional way of life of focusing on our 12 clan system. But a lot of people won't come to ask us. They'll, go to science, and they'll go to, archaeologists, and they'll dig down through soils, and they'll try to study us, and they'll find some stone tools, some pottery maybe, or maybe there's some food cache, or some, privy pit out there. And from that information, it'd be no different than going into your backyards out there, right? And digging down through your soils in your yard there, and you may have lost, some coins, right? Or lost, some silverware when you were sitting out there at the luncheon. Or you have a broken plate, right? And a piece of fine chinaware, and it gets lost in the grass. An archaeologist from 1,000 years now, they're going to dig in your backyard, and they're going to look at that coin, and they're going to say, "Well, wow, that's these people these are the people they worshipped on these little coins, right?" And that pottery there, they must have migrated from China. That's an archaeologist's viewpoint. The proof is in the pudding. They look at that stone tool, they see some pottery, they'll see some shells sitting in our burial systems. And they want to tell us all about us all of a sudden. They want to tell us about our history and our culture and how the way our families ran and how our societies worked. That's science out there. That's what they do. But they won't come to us and ask us our beautiful stories and how things came to be and how things were and how things used to be in our cultural life. We have an accurate oral rendition of our history here. And so when I talk about our history here, we have certain ones that are orators within our tribe, for example. They have the ability to speak formally about not only themselves, but their families, but they also can speak about their communities and speak about Ho-Chunk people as a whole. Our valored warriors, they extend up to the ranks of being able to speak whatever they want within our nation. Our elders, when they get to a certain age and they get a certain experience and some wisdom, they have the ability to speak on certain matters. Folks within our tribal government are reached out there to represent the nation in the public. So we have different speakers that have the ability to do it. Within our families, we have the elders and the family heads. And there's this saying that I'm sure you are in agreement with, that if you don't really know what you're talking about, you shouldn't be talking about it, right? And so but you don't see that in today's society as much. Everybody has something to say, right? But everything has to be accurate. There has to be a process and a place for us to tell stories accurately. And so when we talk about our oral history of the development of Madison, for example, right? Dejo, the lakes as they first come to be, there's beautiful stories. There's a series of stories of how that unfolded and how it is even today. We have the ability today to tell a new form of story or add to that story because of the environmental change that has taken place in an expedited period of time right now. We have the ability to tell that story now so our grandchildren knows what they're coming into, they realize how they got to where they're at. This is our responsibility right here. So that's what I do for, I get paid to do it, first of all, which is really nice for a tribe, but also as a family head and a father to children out here, I have the responsibility to make sure they get accurate history. That's all there is to it. And there's a process. So if I whispered into this lady's ear over here, something frivolous, and she whispered it all the way through here, this crowd, and it comes out to this gentleman over here, that story likely would not survive that trip, right? The story would change. There'd be some chuckling in here. That story would be odd over here, but that's kind of a game, right? That's a game that you play in grade school there to show, I think it's called telephone, right? But that isn't how our oral history is passed on. We oftentimes talk about when our history is spoke about, and we use oral history to do that. Or we also use oral processes there to teach our children, right? Tell them a story of how to become a better individual, how to treat your siblings, or how to act in the public, or as you grow up type things. We have literally hundreds of stories to teach our children that. Oral history that will not ever be written down in a book because we don't want to waste our time writing something down here and it being only a partial story. We don't want to have to go and do another edition, another edition, another edition of a book, and pretty soon your whole life you've been writing books and you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing out there educating your youth. And so we rely mostly on oral history to pass on that with our children. We also have, history to teach young men and women as they grow up and they get into the period of to get married out there, how to become good parents. We have beautiful stories of how to, as you become an elder out there, to become good, representatives and how you pass on your history. And so there's many stories that helps us guide us through life. And so one of the things that oftentimes is difficult to do, though, with many groups today is that, there's two aspects of telling the story. I can talk all day and tell a story, but if you're hearing the story and then you go off on your way over here, you don't take nothing in there, then that's not how oral history works. Oral history works that if I tell something accurate out there and history-wise out there, there's a form of listening. There's hearing and listening is taking something in. And I was told early on in life, from my grandfather Choka, that you got to listen. You got to always, how elders are. You got to listen, and you're trying to get you to slow up and listen. And because he said to me one time, he says, when you talk to me, you talk to your other, your other relatives, well, they're only taking about 10% of what they tell you your whole life. And he's right. In hindsight, after my Choka passed away in '78, my grandfather, I always look back and I remember those stories, and I wish I would have listened a little more all the time, right? 10% is all you normally can collect from your relatives. So you better have 10 good relatives, right? So you get 100%. But that's the key to that is accurate listening is very hard to get somebody to learn how to do nowadays. Listen. And there's a period of questioning and a period of silence, right? And so there's proper ways of speaking. They often say when the Europeans first came over here and tried to settle on land, and they began to negotiate for land, right? That's land cessions, they call it, or treaties. The indigenous folks would sit there in silence, and the folks coming from out east would come here and speak. And they would often sit there and look at them, and they would pass the pipe around because this is their time to think of what was told them. So they can respond back in relatively short words, or very accurate, or not say anything at all. And they were always referred to as being dumb. That the indigenous folks, they don't know how to consult. They don't know how to meet to work on stuff like here, because oftentimes they sit there in silence and stare at you. And it's because their process of consultation was different than Western societies. People expect that this interaction back and forth takes place sentence to sentence, when in reality indigenous tribes tend to focus on the long term, where they'll take a complete thought and then they'll come back and refer to. And oftentimes then we refer to as less than smart as the rest of the group. So that said, we talk about oral history and how it works here. I often talk about all the different things we cover, from our origin stories, environmental change. We share stories with other tribes that are unique. There's 11 federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin. I don't know if you know that. But there was initially, when the first non-indigenous folks stepped ashore in Green Bay in 1634. This is all of our history. And Jean Nicolet, right, stepped ashore in Green Bay in 1634. They say he met none other than my Ho-Chunk people, the Winnebago tribe. That's on the Green Bay area, or Mogo Chutes up there. There it is, a picture of them stepping ashore up there. Well, in the 1600s on, life began to change for indigenous tribes around here. That first interaction between the French, right? And the 1700s, this is all of our history, right? 1700s, who was the next group of people that came here en masse? The British, right? And then in the 1800s, what was the next group of people that came here? Well, it was the early Americans, right? The pioneers and the loggers. And so there's the French, the British, and early Americans. And here we are today, right? And all through that process, you have indigenous tribes out there that are being kind of pushed about over here because they were, less than, equal to those groups of people coming in the other folks' mindset. But anyway, so our stories encompass quite a lot of different things here. The key to us, though, focusing on oral history is that we don't want to waste our time on something that becomes antiquated or becomes defunct or dated, right? I mentioned our history goes all the way back to the last glacier episode. Right about in there, that's Madison, just on the inside of that ice. That ice came down here. You'll hear about the Drumlin Rolls, Ice Age trails, and so on and so forth. That's Madison right there. We have a story that talks about, at one point in time where our elders would sit in a place of refuge. You guys called it the driftless area. That's last touched, it hadn't been touched by the last glacier, right? The driftless area. It's over there by Viroqua, that Kickapoo watershed. But that place of refuge, that's where our ancestors had to reside, in a place of refuge until the glacier decided to go back to the north. And they lived there comfortably for thousands of years. And that's why you find in that region, all the way along that glacier edge there, you'll find remnants of these bones of these large, mastodons and mammoths and whatever animals that they dig up the bones of today. And oftentimes you'll see stone tools laying beside them and marks in the bones of where my ancestors harvested some of those animals there to get through life, right? And so there's evidence of human occupancy during that period of time. And there's no other tribe on this earth that has the ability to claim this is their ancestral footprint. So you stay in the freezing, those are my ancestors that lived in this glacier period right in that footprint there. And one of the stories we pass on to our children is that they talk about a period of time that they said that you could look 3 ways and see no other form but ice. And the sun, you'd only see it at midday and before it's set. Now, it almost sounds like you're standing in Alaska today, right? But in reality, what you're standing is this pocket of ice, right? That was right there. And you'd only see the sun because the ice was such a high item here. They said at some points of the glacier right there, it'd be over a mile thick, right? That's a lot of ice. But to have the stories of how it receded to the north, now the stories get beautiful. They talk about the creation of the Wisconsin River and Lake Winnebago. We talk about the creation and development of these 4 lakes before us, because they weren't here before that glacier come down here. And as it recedes to the north, and this was new to us in our oral history, we began to create stories to tell that story, is how the environment changed to such a high degree. This is what you folks are looking forward to living in. And we had to adapt as humans in here. And how we adapt as humans in here, all those big animals, those megafauna and megafloras, they disappeared. Right? They went the other way. You don't see them anymore, just bones, teeth, right? And stone tools, this is that. And what you're looking at there is change. Because archaeologists, they'll take a spear point, called the Clovis point, made it, say, out of Hickston Quartzsite, up there in Hickston, Wisconsin. Stone tools, you'll find this stone only in the Mississippi watershed, because we used to dig that out and make our tools out of that because it was a preferred tool to work with. And we trade it with other indigenous groups throughout that southern region on there for things that we could bring back here. It was a valuable tool. Well, that Clovis point, if you're an archaeologist or anthropologist, you know what I'm talking about. They say that point was made between 10 to 12,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. This is how they speak. And as the animals and the type of hunting changed in this area, we had to adapt and make our tools a little bit better, a little bit more faster, a little bit more stronger. And they developed what they referred to as the atlatl. Atlatl is a spear that has a throwing stick, something of this length on here, and on the end there'd be a little dowel or that, or a point on here, and you shorten your spear, and you put that spear in here, and you flip it, that spear goes much more faster. A lot more quicker animals were replacing these large, slow megafauna, fauna out there. And so you had the bison, you had the caribou out there, you had all these things coming in here that, you couldn't just stand around something and constantly spear it and kill it out there. You had to catch up to them now. And we developed the atlatl. And soon after that, after the atlatl went through here, we had all those other animals that came in here because those large bison that was here were replaced by smaller bison, and the caribou went the other way. And we had the elk come in here and the white-tailed deer eventually, and all these other different animals that we began to prefer to hunt over here. And our tools went from the atlatl to the bow and arrow, right? Bow and arrow came up here just before the Spaniards came into this area here, where they developed the horse riding, and they couldn't, take, atlatl very effectively on horses. And the bow was developed, and that's just the way progression. So you can see a progression in time by the adaptation of tools. Our society was changing in so many different ways other than just hunting techniques. You could be speaking for weeks on how we adapted as humans all the way up to when the first French arrived, right? So as we went through time here, we realized that, there was more people during the historic periods that were moved in here. We had the Sioux sitting off to our friends to the west, the Mississippi, and they came into the Wisconsin area. right? And then through time, the Menominee had came just after the last glacier episode from the east, and they established themselves up by northern, Michigan area. But then the Chippewa come, the last 600 years, in the last couple hundred years, we had the Oneida, Forest County Potawatomis, the Potawatomis, had all these tribes that were being pushed from the east, from the Beaver Wars over there into our Wisconsin areas. And so during those historic periods, this is just a timeline. And this is our oral history talking about how we first seen these new peoples come. We have beautiful stories of how they first arrived, and our name for them in Ho-Chunk puts us in that place and time of when we met them. Menominee, for example, Kaki, that's what we call them right there. That's where we first met them out here. It was referring to the raven in Ho-Chunk, the raven. And the reason why they're called the raven in our name is because our elders of old that sat here near Mogashoots here at one time looked off to the east there just as the sun was about to rise. And if you look across these bodies of water when they're real calm, you can't really differentiate the water's edge in the sky at a certain period of time in the day. And so they all look like the one. And as the elders were looking off to the east there, they realized there was a flock of raven, they figured, because they were black, were coming across and lighting themselves upon the water. And as they grew closer, we realized they weren't ravens at all. They were humans. They were people just like us, but they were in different watercrafts than we were accustomed to. And we sent some of our warriors along the shoreline right through here. And when the Menominee that were coming from the east over here realized there was people coming at them, they grew fearful. And they beached their watercrafts, and they hid it amongst the trees, pretty much where the Menominee River is there today. And our men come back and told the elders, well, these people, they're like us, but they're from out east, or out from that direction over there, and it's like that, they're scared of us. And they said, well, you go talk them down out of the trees and bring them back here, and we'll put on a feast for them and get to know who they are. And we did that, and through time, we grew accustomed to the Menominee people coming here, and they reorganized themselves right there, and they've been there to this day. That's how the Menominee first arrived here. But that beautiful story of that raven refers to the fact that as they were paddling their canoes across what it looked as if it was a body of a bird coming off the sky, their oars were glistening in the sun. And as they were paddling, it looked like these bird wings coming, and it looked like a bunch of these birds coming down and lighting on the water. And so they've received that name, Kaki, and that's the name that we refer to them to this day. And they were some of the first people that was first to arrive after that last glacier episode in this region. And every group of people that comes in here, including you folks, we talk about, a name that we, Machichate, we call you folks, big knives. It describes your soldiers that came in the brass, the big guys, they always had a sword on them. And Machichate means nothing more than those that carry the big knives, because those are the ones that would sit and negotiate with you. So every name we have for other groups of people is very descriptive. That's just the way our language is. And we talk about our ancestral footprint on here, though. We talk about a period of time as all of this area right here was newfound to us after that last glacier episode began and receded to the north. And one of the things I do at times is to show about the period of time, that I'm standing in to this day over here and where it relates to oral history. I bring a tool, and I'm going to get that tool. Is that Francis in here yet? Or is there, was there a Jill in here?
Jill.
Is she sleeping in another room? Okay. Okay, well, I'm going to, you don't move. I'm going to have you hold something a second. Now, I use this oftentimes here to show a period of time on here, because this is nothing more than a 50-foot rope. But on this 50-foot rope, I have ribbons on this rope, and on this ribbon are significant periods of time that we talk about with our youth or with our groups to get them a better understanding of where we are at today in history. So if you can hang on to this edge of that rope, like that. Just hang on to that. Okay. If I can get you to come up here and hold this up together. Stand on this side of your paw. Come on over here. And face the crowd. And if you want to hold your hand on this rope, right, if you come on this side and hold that right there. Perfect. Oh, Dale. So this is going to be easy. I'm going to have this gentleman down here hold the end of this rope. Can I get you to hold that? Now, you don't have to pull it out of those folks' hands on here, but I'm going to use this as a timeline. All right. This lady over here, what's her first name?
This is Janice.
Janice. No way.
Yeah, back, yeah.
Way to go, Janice. Here we go. Janice is now Miss 2025, because here's the reason. Janice, Miss 2025, that's today. That's us standing here in time. Who are you? Look at this name.
I'm John,
Okay, John, who are you and then?
1492.
Who sailed the blue?
Christopher Columbus.
This guy is Christopher Columbus. From this point on here to G. Nicolay stepping ashore in Green Bay in 1634, us becoming a state in 1848. This is the history that we talk about in third grade school, right? This is the history of the Americas, okay? A lot of people don't understand. On this rope, literally for 50 foot, you could literally tie hundreds if not thousands of ribbons on here of all the beautiful oral history stories that puts us in time. All the way back to at 50 foot is 12,000 years back. That's when the glacier was here. 12,000 years. Okay, and there's another important rope here. A rope on here that I often refer to as, I used to call it 0, but it's 1. I was told by a third grader there is no 0 on our calendar. So it was 1 BC or 180, all right? Whatever you want to call it. I don't know how that works yet. I'm not going to try to figure it out a pool. But that they say at one time there was this very important individual on the other side of this earth walked for a short period of time, and he had such an influence on us as humans on here, then he disappeared. So this would be Jesus, right here. They say at one time Jesus walked this earth for a short period of time, and he has changed the world to such a high degree. Now, whether that happened factually or not, don't matter to me, okay? It don't matter. What does matter is what he brought with the Spaniards, with the French, the British, with the early Americans on here, because they brought this form of Christianity, right, into the Americas. And they wanted everybody else to have this Christianity. So they tried their darndest to strip us of our culture, our heritage, and our beliefs, and our way of life over here. And it would have succeeded if we hadn't been, so diligent in protecting our culture and our history through oral practices. This is the only way we are able to keep our culture and heritage intact, is constantly passing this on to our children and grandchildren, what our belief system that's got us through 12,000 years versus 3,000 or 4,000 years. Now, the important thing about this is that Christopher Columbus come here, did the same thing. The first French come in here, and then right behind those explorers, I think I might have an image of that up here. Let me see if I can get to it. Right behind those, let's see if I did. That's a story there in itself. Now, there's an image I have up on one of my presentations here that it shows the first explorers, Jesuit priests right behind them, and those fur traders, right? And those Jesuit priests, they called them the Black Robes back then. They were right behind them, trying to do exactly what they were supposed to be doing over here, bringing Christianity into this area. And there's this thing about Wisconsin or the U.S. over here, is this government mentality over there, this manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is nothing more than this God-given right that this land was yours, and that there should be nothing that gets in between. And that's why there was this push to get rid of all the indigenous tribes throughout the footprint of the U.S. That said, this has happened throughout the world. This is just our culture, our times of life. I talk about this period of time right on here. This is why we don't rely on the written language. This is why we don't rely on the electronic process out there. We utilize it, but we don't place all of our eggs in that basket. And the reason being is that there are past cultures here that we know nothing about, right? That culture is here. That period of time is about right here. Right? There's Jesus out there, and then you get on to the ribbon on here, and this one says 2000 BC. That's the Egyptians, South America putting in their stoneworks. Up in here, there was a few remnants of that process. Way back in there, stoneworks, right? What happens is that if you don't take care of yourself, and you disappear out here, there's no way of keeping your history and culture and heritage alive. Now, we're good with that. I mean, that history and culture that we hold for our children and grandchildren, if we all cease to exist, it isn't yours to have anyway. It should just go along with us. We don't care. But what does happen is that you can have one solar blip, they say, and everything will be gone tomorrow. And all these librarians and archivists out there and historians that are taking and writing all their book and putting it into, thumb drives and computers out there and getting rid of, the books because it's taking up so much storage space on there. Well, all that storage can go away tomorrow, right? The last thing about here is I mentioned how during those historic periods, everybody tried their damnedest to get rid of us, right? And this happened on the other side of the earth in the 40s. You guys all remember this, where they took one group of people, they separated their men and their women and their children, right? And they took every piece of literature that they could find of them and they began to burn it in the streets. They were trying to wipe them off the face of this earth because they knew that if they could get rid of this written language, they could be gone forever. And if it wasn't for us protecting that process down there, that would have happened, right? So we don't rely on written language is what I'm getting back at too. But during the periods of time when the first French first got on here, we knew the change was going to be great. And what happened here was that during the process of this land getting these newfound landowners on it there, they wanted to sign treaties with us. You'll hear about the treaties of Wisconsin and Winnebago tribe. We had, I think, 11 treaties that took away every acre of our land in Wisconsin, and they put us in these little footprints, and they reduced it. Finally, the removals began for the Ho-Chunk people. And so this date sounds maybe familiar to you, in 1826 and 1837, all the way up to 1870, those periods of time there. Now remember what I'm talking about, the history. What were you doing in 1848? You're becoming a state, right? Well, our removals were taking place. That's our Trail of Tears. So Ho-Chunk were moved to no less than 4 different reservations. One in Turkey River, then up to Long Prairie, Minnesota, to Blue Earth. Then they finally shipped us on steamboats all the way out there, all the way up to Crow Creek, South Dakota. 4 different removals, if not more, trying to get rid of us or put in as a place that we were foreign to, that they were just putting us out of sight, out of mind. And if we hadn't kept our oral history and our traditions, our way of life with us in here, we weren't allowed to take anything with us, right? Just the blankets on our back for the most part out there. And we lost a lot of our culture and our history through that process because it's pretty hard to excel as a group of people when you're trying to survive, they say out there. So that history right there is this period right here. Those removal periods during the 1800s on here. It was very devastating for the Ho-Chunk people. Along with every other tribe east of the Mississippi, they moved us all to the west. Most of them ended up in Oklahoma. Some went down to Kansas. Some went down to Mexico, right? But the Ho-Chunk were a little stubborn. I hate to say it. We just kept coming back. We'd make dugout canoes and come back down here, and we'd go out and hide out as aliens in our own ancestral footprint. And to encourage the protection of our history and stuff, we had to form a government, is what we did. And so in 63, everybody here must have been alive in 63, we formed what they referred to as the Winnebago Nation at that time. We weren't really Winnebago people. As I mentioned, we call ourselves the Ho-Chunk, right? The people of the sacred language. Winnebago is an Algonquin term that they were referring to us with the French. So in 1994, we reverted to the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, and that's our tribal government, right? This is all history that you can find in books nowadays, but we prefer to tell this history orally to pass it on, right? That said, a lot of people say, well, how accurate is your history really, right? And I'm going to leave it at this. Well, I had an elder here, he passed away now, is Jim Funmaker here. And back in 2000, I think it was in 2004, we were asked, in short, as a tribal government, because federal agencies out there back in the early 2000s, they decided to create what they've referred to as tribal liaison officers. They just took somebody off their staff or role there and gave them another hat and said that you are now a tribal liaison, because all the big cheeses in federal agencies, they don't want to deal directly with you with questions. They want somebody to buffer that. That's just the way government works. So anyway, out of the deal there, here's this tribal liaison come in there to our office one day, around the corner in this cubicle over here, and I could hear him in one ear, and I was listening to Jim complain about the very thing I mentioned earlier, is that our environment is changing so fast. He's an elder, 94 at this time, I think at this time over here. He brought this little snake in this box to us. And that little snake, he says, that shouldn't be here. He's talking Ho-Chunk now. He's just yelling at Bill Kingswan and I, for lack of a better term. He was just yelling at us. The snake, he says, this shouldn't be here. And he says, we lost all of our rice to the north since his age, right? You know, all of our rice is going north. And our birch, you can't even find a birch to save your soul. They're all getting small and shrink. You can't build anything out of birch anymore. And he's running through all the plants and animals that we were losing in his lifetime. And he was getting across to us is that this should never be happening in one person's lifetime. Never, ever. Our oral history is not able to cover generations of change. You know, that period of time is such a speeding up from 1492 all the way up here. Our history is just stepping all over itself, right? But he was complaining about that. He says, you're the Ho-Chunk people. Because he didn't believe in our tribal government to any degree, because our tribal government was just a conduit, right? For us to begin receiving federal dollars out of Washington. You know, you don't really need a tribal government when you got our tribal cultural ways of life, our processes there. But we needed something, you know, to establish to be recognized as a sovereign nation in the 60s to gain Indian health, you know, BIA roads. There was different aspects of funding out there that we didn't have privy to, because other tribes that were recognized as sovereign nations on these reservations, right, they were gaining dollars and support by the federal government already. And we're an at-large tribe. Like I mentioned, we kept coming back. We didn't have a reservation. We just kept hiding out in Wisconsin. So we don't have a reservation per se, other than some allotments that are scattered across 13 or 14 counties. That said, we formed our tribal government. He says, you're a government, you should be in Washington. You're telling them, you guys are killing Mother Earth. You got to turn it around. We got to be good neighbors. We got to work together, right? And he's yelling at us. Well, here's this liaison asking about, oh, you can wind that up. Sorry about that, ladies. Yeah, you can wind that up. I'll refer to it. But there's one thing on this rope. This here, 1,200 years back, that blue ribbon, this 3,000-year ribbon here will play a prominent role in a second. There should be another ribbon almost to 5,000 years, kind of where those pyramids are on that rope. I'm going to put that on there soon. I'll go to that real quick. I want to get back to Jim here. Those ribbons are where those dugout canoes in Lake Mendota were found. That was a period of time, 1,200 years back, 3,000 years back, and now they have one that's close to 5,000 years before present that they have at the bottom of Lake Mendota. That's a lot of human history in your little town here, Dejol. And those ancestors of mine are the ones that had those dugout canoes on here. And just because they found a 5,000-year-old dugout canoe doesn't mean that we weren't here older. You know, that's just as far back as they have found something physical now. They don't listen to our oral history, like I say, but boy, they find a chunk of wood in the water, and that's proof you might have been here, right? And there we are. But then back to Jim here, it's important because that liaison was walking out there, and he came there, he worked for NRCS, for the Soil Service Agency, and he was asking if we had any oral history or history of this anomaly that took place down there where the Wisconsin River confluences into the Mississippi. He says, we found a soil, substrate of soil there that we can't figure it out, like that, and it's real recent. You can't find the soil anywhere else in the earth, he said. And Jim, we asked Jim as they were walking out there, and Jim Funmaker said, hey, yeah, he straightened up a little bit. He only found like 5 foot tall it is. He stands up, yeah, I might have a few stories, he said, like that, about that how that could have happened down there. If you can come back next week, he said, like that, maybe I'll share that story with you. And that, of course, that tribe liaison, he was like, well, I'll come back next week, right? So next week comes around, and they went to what we refer to as traditional court. We have a court system within our tribal government. And so, yeah, the executive, and you got all your judicial branches in there. We have the luxury within our tribe of what we refer to as a traditional court. And a traditional court is nothing more than on the back side of the courthouse of ours, there's a room, maybe a quarter size of this room in here. And in the center of that room, there's a beautiful stone, circle there for fire. They got a chimney that goes out, they turn the fan on, but there's 12 chairs sits around this fire on here. And it's 12 clan leaders that represents each one of our 12 clans within our tribe. And they make judicial decisions. If you go in there with an honest question, something, as a matter of fact, do you have any stories about, how the soil came to be, right? These elders would talk across this fire because they say you can never tell an untruth across fire. Fire is the light, right? And so as the elders, they went there Monday morning to talk to this group that he didn't believe in, believe it or not, because they were like 20, 30 years younger than he was, young pups. But they said combined, those elders sits in that circle, there's no less than 800 years of knowledge of 12 different clans, making decisions. And that's an important thing that our tribe has the luxury of, these knowledgeable ones. And if I have a question or a stumped on something, I can go and ask. And they usually give me an accurate answer. It might take them a little bit of quietness and thought. But so here they went and asked those elders, in a circle. And they come back out, they have the same answers. As you come back next week, we might have something. And as they were coming out here comes Jim, Funmaker, pulling up in there. And the parking lot was gravel at that time. And he drove this Pontiac 6000. It's a older, big car, but it only had one tire that had a brake. And as he was coming to a stop in the gravel, that back tire was just skidding to a halt, that car. And he gets out, hey, church guy, he's asking, telling us, I got that story. If you need that story about that, how that soil might have come to be down there. And they said, yeah. He said, we just talked to traditional courts. You go, oh yeah, you don't talk to them, And he said, I got that story. So, and he began to start talking about this story that has this title. It's a Nulchma Ruhani Chade. And all it is stating is that 2002. And it's when the ice and the earth formed a dam for a short period of time on Nichade. Remember the big river I told you about here, the Mississippi? And it made the water flow up the Mississippi River for a short period of time. We got beautiful stories how the river flowed backwards and how the sturgeon first came to be up there by Baraboo area. That's where we first met our sturgeon. Anyway, so he's like, I got this story. And he starts talking about Nuchma Ruha Nichade. Our elders were sitting in this place of refuge. And he was watching this lake from this dam being developed up the Wisconsin River. They said the water was coming down and off the glacier melt and flowing up to Wisconsin backwards, and it laked out, right? It got up to a degree it couldn't run no more. And as it slowed up there, he says, this is where your soils that you're talking about come from. It come from up north, and it had to have been coming up there and just deposited there. And then that glacier, dam broke, and it caused a lot of what you call the coulee regions today in Wisconsin, and how that big dam up there broke later on around, the Quackenbush that come down there, and that's how that developed. He's talking about the history of how the earth was changing right before our elders' eyes, and that he was skeptical. Jim Radke was his name, and he was a tribal liaison, and he said, oh, that's interesting. But then he took that soil that they had discovered as a band of gray model clays of silt or something like that, and did an analysis on it. And it was actually created from the watershed of the Minnesota, the parts of St. Croix, but also the Mississippi watershed from the glacier receding, and taking that fine sediment that was ground up and mixing it all the way down Nichade, right? The big Mississippi, just like a big old mixing bowl. But then when it got to that lake, it sedimented out, left that layer across there on the shoreline edge, and then as that dam broke out there was no more evidence to it. That's what Jim Radke had said, well, that's the only way it could have possibly been made. Well, he thought that was impressive enough to where they went back and they decided to name that new soil series. Let's see if I got it here. Oh, that's that rope you guys just had in your hand, by the way. I do it with kids all the time. They love it. So there it is. It's hard to read up here, but if you look up here, it says Nuchma Ruha Nichades Similar Soil Series. And they named that in the book. The soil series in Richland County has that soil series named after what Jim Funmaker gave him for a name for it there. And so they were down here in Madison. I think they're actually up by Lake Mendota. And they had a podium like this, and they're announcing this new soil series I discovered in collaboration with the Ho-Chunk people. They gave it a name on here. And that Radke, he said, now the Ho-Chunk history is backing up our science. He's like talking about how they had discovered this. And Jim was there, and he goes, Cut. Well, no, and Ho-Chunk is Cut. He's a Cut. He says, and he gets up there, he says, your science is now backing up our history. And everybody's like staring at this, And he says, your Ho-Chunk history's been here for tens of thousands of years. Your science just got here. He's like, there. And then Jim Radke's just kind of like chewing on his lip. But it's true. I mean, it is nice to see, how things combine. And that's why we work at a high degree when we present. We talk about science. It has its role, right? Those ribbons on that rope, them discovering, materials that rightfully shouldn't be here, but only due to, the lake's bottom being so mucky and lack of oxygen. And all these dugout canoes are discovering on the shorelines, the ancient shorelines of that lake bottom down there, right? Now they're discovering it down there. And they're bringing them up there. They brought 2 up there. And the one that they got close to protected and preserved to a higher degree, the 1,200-year-old one, they're going to hopefully place this in the new Heritage Center that you guys have, a history center coming up on the square in Madison down here, the old museum.
Yes.
Right now they're going to have that dugout hopefully ready for the grand opening down there. So it's interesting to see how our history of talking about how we utilize these big watercrafts for tens of thousands of years around here. And every time you look in a book and you ask children in 3rd grade there, if you, in your mind, draw as colors, take color crayons, draw on this piece of paper here, how you see indigenous people, going across a lake in the water or down the creeks or whatever it is. And they'll always draw a birch bark canoe. That's just a mentality, right? And we'll be like in buckskins or not even that. And we'll have feathers in our hat. And that's just the mentality. And so we're trying to get past that, this mentality of indigenous tribes being nomadic. And if you hear about our history, and when we talk about our history, the terminology that folks use to describe our history is right here. Did I put it in here? Yeah. This line down here is hard for some to see. It says legends and folklore and myths. That's how they refer to our accurate history, as something a little more derogative than the written history as being accurate. Because when I sit in consultation, that's another side of my job, to consult and protect cultural resources on projects, federal undertakings they call them. My oral history holds as much, if not more, weight in the federal acts out there. But when I meet to consult with those folks over there that want us to put a highway through this or build this building over here with federal dollars out here, yeah, or pipelines, they will not listen to my oral history and give it just as much credit as an archaeologist writing an anthropological report over here about their thoughts on a project over there. And they'll take that written history as more weight than my oral history. And I can prove you 10 times over our accurate history is much more accurate than an archaeologist's history of my culture. But it's hard to press, even though the federal law states that it has to hold an equal in the consideration of that project, it never really does. So I still have some uphill battles that I do. But out of this deal, this is, as I mentioned, our tribe, we have beautiful stories. And you'll see it on rock art, right? They say, oh, your oral history is, it's too bad you didn't write them down, but we did. A lot of our major stories are written written in rock, right? And stone, they say. And we have beautiful stories. We actually even purchase properties out there in our ancestral footprint that has these beautiful stories on them now. Our nation's government, it's comprised of 80-20, they say out there. In a government, if you know what 80-20 means, that's your funding out there. So if you get 100% up here, 80% normally is supposed to go towards programs and projects and help your constituents. That's the way it's supposed to be run. And 20% is for overhead and running staff and running the administration. Washington's a little different today. Washington's 2080 right now. They get 80% of your dollars and 20 goes out to your programs. And but tribes so far have been able to stick to that 80-20 yet. So our monies go into buying properties that I see as culturally significant now. I'll buy properties if I can do it out there, to tell beautiful stories. Like I said, our language is very descriptive. There's certain things we can say in our language that you cannot justifiably, translate it into English or any other language. It's just the beautiful words we have is hard to translate too. And when I asked, for example, what this beautiful area was into this region, it's the Quackenbush. It's a sacred water, sacred lake out there, most sacred aspect of our ancestral footprint. And yet, today, it's often referred to as Devil's Lake, right? And there's a campground on it. I don't even have the ability to take my tribal youth and fast on this sacred area over here because it's so encumbered by adverse effects, right? And I look for a day, right? We pass on through generations' time. Maybe this will be all gone tomorrow, and we'll have that back as a sacred eye, and we'll have our stories that are strong to utilize that site down there. But to date, it's still referred to as Devil's Lake. We want to change that. So anyway, so that I'm going to leave it at that there for a little bit. This is that circle I'll talk about. This is how our tribal governance is run. This is how your government is tended to be run, and just in a different language, right? If you look here, you got your, we refer to them as the 4 upper clans, but they're not really physically upper. It's just they're air clans, right there. You got the judicial groups out there. You got your leaders. You got your, the folks, the warrior clan. This is how governments are made. This is how Madison is made. That's your judicial system, right? That's your city hall and your whatever runs your local areas. But then you got your environmentalists over here. You got your waters and then down here you got the people that take care of you. The wolf and the bear clan for us are our police force. The bear clan is, right? And the Bear Clan, they say if you take one aspect of your culture away, your government goes away. And it's like, our secular government, right? You take your police force in Madison and say, we don't need you no more, you go on home. And it'd be just chaos, right, in Madison, in short time. Well, that's the same as ours. If we happen to lose one of these aspects on here, it would be very hard or difficult to traditionally keep our people who we are as a culture. We've been doing it for tens of 12 thousands of years here, right? And this is how we fall back onto every time. Every clan, I'm Deer Clan. I have the ability to do what Deer Clan folks do. There's duties and responsibilities that I do. There's no Jeremiah Johnsons. You can't do it all. You can if you want, but it doesn't go well. But you got to rely on your community. That's how you get by. That's the society they call it, right? Deer Clan here, we're the environmentalists, and we're the ones that are the most sensitive to the change out there, and we have the ability to foresee the weather, for example. Our elders teach our children from infancy on, the sensitivity of ensuring that when you're standing upon Mother Earth, that you don't have your shoes on, right? At all times, that you have an opportunity to stay in contact with what made you, right? And they say each and every one of us here, are brought from this earth, right? It's a spirit that keeps us here, but then as soon as this disappears, we go back to the earth. That's just everybody's belief. And that is the case. We carry on in the next journey in life. Right? To do that, though, you got to get through life, right? But that's how governments run. If you took your sanitation folks from Madison and said, we don't need you anymore, we're just going to wipe you out. And that's what was happening during those removal periods, right? They were taking us and separating us and trying to destroy our culture in a way, and they knew how to do it quite well, right? But they just didn't succeed with our tribe. Our stories are always told the exact same way. When I was growing up, my grandfather, instead of us having our summers in school to have off and run around and go swimming and do whatever, my brother and I, in hindsight, at the time we thought we were being forced, but he was adamant that we were going to learn aspects of our culture. And he would make us sit next to him throughout the summer. And we lived right on Highway 12 up by Black River Falls. And you'd see everybody else going swimming or going down to Wisconsin Dells or doing whatever they do in the summertime. And there's me and my brother sitting there having to sit next to my grandfather, tending a little fire next to him. He sat there in that chair of his. And on that fire, he put a little pail of water. And we'd have to keep that fire at a certain temperature where it would just boil enough to get steam on there, because he would make these items. He would make back scratchers, bows and arrows. He'd make handles for these black ash baskets. There used to be these basket stands all the way along. In short, he also would make cording flutes once in a while. He worked at what they referred to as the box factory in Black River Falls. He was in the housekeeping or janitors at that time. I'd sweep the floor constantly and this and that. And every time a rake or a shovel or a handle would break on any of their tools or equipment, he'd bring those broken handles home. Because those handles were selected by, folks making those tools there because they had straight grain. And they're very strong usually. But he loved the straight grain because he could make a beautiful flute out of that. And so he would just bring those handles home. He'd have them stacked up there, and we'd make flute out of there. And one day I was looking down at his flute. It wasn't made out of a handle. It was made out of a piece of sumac, just like this was. And I asked him, I joke, when I was a kid, I was talking in Ho-Chunk quite a lot with him. And, And I asked him about that flute. He said, what is it? He said, oh, you get older. He says, like that flute. He says, that becomes important to young men. He says, that's what you use to, use it at court, to court, a young gal. And I go, what, really? He goes, yeah, you play that flute, you learn songs on there. And he says, it's just like you can draw, young girls with that flute. And I go, oh, really? So he shows us how to make flute. My brother and I was sitting there, and so now they're interested, right? I'm at that age, I'm thinking about girls probably. And now he's teaching me something I finally can learn, right? And so anyway, so here he is talking about the flute, and it comes with a story. And everything, like I say, comes with a story. Everything has to be told through a story, through repetition. In time, you get it up here, you can't get rid of it. It's like, when I mentioned Jack and Jill went up the hill, what'd they fetch? Pail of water. Everybody knows that, right? Where'd you get that, right? It was beat into your head by teachers or your parents or whatever. You can't even remember, but you can say it to the day you die. And you can say it to your children and your children's grandchildren. And if you watch your children telling your grandchildren how to say Jack and Jill went up the hill enough times, there's a 3-generation process there that it gets it accurate. And that's no different than when we tell stories. We have, in our old ways of life, there would be a lodge. Every winter when the snow would hit the ground there, we'd build our chipoteques, right, our lodges that we'd sleep in, our houses, our homes, chipoteques. And you'd have the parents and the grandparents and kids and maybe grandkids in this one circle there. You have all your food caches and everything was good. You did all your due diligence and got your gardening done and harvested enough meat and dried it. You'd live through a winter, right? When the snow hits the ground is when our education begins. That's when the stories would begin. You sit to build that fire inside there, you have to tell truth across these fires. And our elders have nothing else to do but to teach our grandchildren while I was telling all these stories. And they would tell those stories. Jack and Jill went up the hill, right? And the kids would be like, oh my God, 3 months of this. Holy, here we go. And, Grandpa, Choka, would say, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a Ford pickup truck. Do you know what would happen? His kids sitting there, right? Their parents would say, no, Choka, that's not the story. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. And Choka would, oh, yes, that's right. Jack and Jill went up the hill. So there's a redundancy process, right? Multi-generations of people hearing the same stories is a redundancy process of accurate history. And the kids, they love that. Oh, here it's getting on, right? Grandpa is fighting with Mom over there, and they just love that interaction. Pretty soon those kids are, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water, Grandpa, So it's in there, right? And so through time, that's how you learn oral history. So here's Joka out there. He's talking to me about the flute, and he says, the story, you've got to listen to it. The story comes with, our flutes play with 6 holes, he says, and each part of the story, I tell you, he's sitting there telling that each story comes through this flute. So he says, at one time, he says, there was this young boy, he says, Kunu, remember I mentioned a firstborn, or Kunu, Hena, the Wiha, the names of our kids before they get names, they have these firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn. Well, Kunu, he was like a young man growing up in this little village here in Dejop, up by the lake. And he was always well-liked in the community there. All his friends really looked up to Kunu because seems like he was kind of a natural leader. The parents loved him, and the grandparents and the elders around there loved him because every time they'd have something special going on or something that people would come to visit, he'd always be one of the first ones to come up there and, hey, how can I help? What can I do? He was always out there, and he was well liked amongst the village. But then one day he started looking at this one girl. He noticed it was real beautiful, and he became enamored with her a little bit. And he started staring at her to such high degree that he fell in love with her a little. And then as he would talk to her a little bit, he realized how nervous he was getting around her. And he began to avoid her. Every time they had a doing or a gathering with a group of people out there or anything, he'd see her over there, he'd stand on the other side of the group. And he was avoiding her. And he said every time I started, talking to her, my tongue would get real thick and nothing would come out, just a blah, 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 blah. Well, so then one day he was walking through the village there early in the morning there. One of the grandfathers were sitting next to a fire bringing the coals back to life on it there. And he walked over to his grandfather and he says, Joka, he says, I got a problem. I was wondering if you can help me with it. And Choka, he says, yeah. He says, sit down. He says, like that. We noticed that you're got an issue. He says, like that. And he says, we see you're avoiding, that one girl. He goes, yeah. He goes, I don't know what to do about it. He goes, well, we talked amongst ourselves. He says, I think we have a solution. We can fix that for you. He said, tomorrow morning, when you wake up, he says, you take that spear pouch of yours and take that fire starter pouch over there and take your water bag and you go to the north. He goes, keep walking. He said, there, and you need to find Chaskacha Day. It's just big white deer. And he goes, oh, he says, he'll have something for you. He says, to gift you. You bring it back here and it'll help you win over your heart's desire. And so Kuna got excited, He went and slept that night, got up early before the whole village got up there, and he grabbed his spear pouch and his tobacco pouch and his water bottle or water pouch, and he headed out. And went to the north, and soon after that, he crossed this big, giant deer track. Biggest track he ever saw. And he goes, this must be Chaskaska's track. He's looking around looking for this big white deer, right? And didn't see it, but he started following the track. He followed and followed and followed until late in the afternoon and the evening. He got so tired of walking, he decided he'd better stop, that evening there. But he knew he was getting closer to it, because the tracks, if you're a tracker at all, you can tell by that little dimple of dirt that sticks up between the toes there, that if it's hard, it's white, it's white. If it's real soft, it falls over. And so he's goes down to and found the stream there and collected some water in his water belch and then started his fire. And he placed some tobacco across that fire and he's saying his prayers to the Creator there, thanking him for taking him on this journey to see if he can find that great white deer there to receive whatever he had for him to help him win over his heart's desire. Well, so then he fell fast asleep. And in his sleep, this little red-headed woodpecker comes to Kuno there and he says, Kuno, he said, you did a good thing. He says, you listened to your elder. He said like that, and you found, the tracks of Chaskaska Day. He says, if you keep following those, he says like that, you'll soon run into him, and he'll gift you that item for you to come back and win over your heart's desire. Well, so then the next morning he wakes up there and he takes some more tobacco there and he says his morning prayers to his Creator there and thanking him for putting him where he is at today. And he gets up and he starts following this track, and he's following another full day, and he's walking kind of towards the west there, and he gets up into this hilly region area, this country area here, and he looks in between these two saddles of the trees just as the sun was setting over there, and lo and behold, there's a silhouette of a big giant deer standing sideways looking back at him. And he's looking at that deer, and it's black, he says, because the sun was on the other side of it, but he said that must be Chaskaska Day. And he was so tired from not eating for 2 days and just drinking a little bit of water, so he pulled out that spear. He pulled out that spear, and he was about ready to throw it at the deer, because he didn't know any other way of slowing it down. He didn't want to keep this process up there. And as he pulled that spear back there to throw it at that, our Mother Earth, she kind of did something that she's always did ever since time immemorial for us. In the evening, she tends to take that big giant breath, and she releases it, and everything grows quiet in the woods, right? And all the animals even stop moving. Maybe a squirrel, you'll hear him running, but everything's just deathly quiet. And as she was taking that deep breath and releasing that breath, Kuno heard this. And the moment Kuno heard that, he had his spear back there, but he looked up onto the ridge where that sound come from, and it was something he had never heard before. And he was sitting there, and he looked back, and he looked to where the great white deer was, and it had disappeared, fell out the back of the hill. And so he thought to himself, wow, he goes, and he was so tired, he went back down to the valley down there, and he found some water and put it in his water bag, and he built himself a fire, and he put some tobacco across there, and started thanking his Creator once again, and he fell fast asleep. And the woodpecker came back to him in his dream. He says, Kudu, he says, you did a good thing. He says, you followed his track. He finally found Chaskaska Day. He says, and you go back there tomorrow morning and you receive exactly what he brought you here to receive. And Kuno woke up the next morning as if that dream had never happened. It was like God was talking to you right now. And he quickly puts some tobacco across there and thanked his creator for that day. And he gets up there and he starts walking up through the valleys up there, and he gets to where those two trees were the saddle, or the two hills are the saddle. And as the sun was rising behind him, he says that very same thing that she does, that since time immemorial, she did it once again. She took that deep breath and blew it out. And as she blew it out there, he heard this. And the moment he had heard that, he realized this must be what Chashkash that he had probably heard for. So he walked up to the saddle, walked up on the side of the hill where that sound come, and he looked up there, and there was a tree there, and in that tree was his limb, like that. And on that limb sat that little red-headed woodpecker.